I'm Eva from The Charm of It, and I would like to welcome you to my kitchen table so that I can do a little tutorial on how to make any mitten pattern convertible. And by convertible, I just mean that you can open it up and then you have your fingers. You could also do this on the thumb. I don't bother with that because it's the fingers that I really need to make mittens useful. And I've also got that conductive thread, so I can sew that on the thumb if I want to be able to use my smartphone. But I find convertible mittens are so much more useful than regular mittens, but most of the mitten patterns that I love are just irregular styles. So there's this great photo and word tutorial on a blog, but I thought a video tutorial might be nice as well. So I'm definitely piggybacking on her knowledge, and we'll include the link to that below. So there's only one thing you need to do while you're knitting your mitten pattern. You follow the pattern just as normal. It doesn't matter how decorative the back is. I've also done this on colorwork mittens. So that's really nice because it doesn't interrupt the patterning at all, and there's no real line. These particular mittens are made with the Innsbruck pattern, which is from Vintage Modern Knits, and as you can see, you knit a cable pattern and then you do the embroidery later. And in case you're wondering, I used Quince & Company Lark in the color Bird Egg. Okay, so when you're knitting, you need to knit across the palm with waste yarn. And I would suggest trying the mitten on once you've got your thumb on waste yarn as well, to figure out where you want to place it. I put these a little higher than ideal. Ideally, because you're going to knit a cuff, I would say that ideally you probably want to put the waste yarn right where your fingers start. I have remarkably short pinkies anyway, but so if I had put it just a few rows lower, then it would have been like this. And it really just depends so much on your gauge, so I can't give you a firm number on how many rows to go in between. But you can kind of just look at how much space you have between your thumb and the base of your finger and judge it that way if you don't want to try them on. So all you do is when you're knitting your mitten, you get to the palm and you take some waste yarn and you knit across the palm in waste yarn. If it's color work, you just knit across. You're always going to just do a plain knit row. And then, so you've dropped your working yarn here. You knit across with waste yarn. Then you go back and you knit across with your working yarn. So if you were doing a color work one, you would then resume doing the color work chart with both colors. And so you're knitting into the waste yarn. And what that does is makes it very easy to open up the mitten later. So that is your next step once you have finished everything to making it convertible. So my waste yarn happens to be quite similar in color to my working yarn. Hopefully you can still see the difference. And all I do is I go in with my needle and I start to unpick. And you can see that the stitches below, it's going to be very obvious how to pick them up. The stitch above always seems a little bit trickier to me, so that's the one that I really pay attention to as I'm unraveling. I usually let these stitches just hang out as long as I'm knitting with a wool yarn because they're not really going to run. And that way it's just a little less fiddly. So what I've done is taken the waste yarn I've pulled it out of the first leg, and then I'm just going to follow the line of the waste yarn with one needle to start picking up stitches along this top flap, and I'm using a second needle to continue to pull out the waste yarn. And now my first stitch is free down below. And as I said, I just ignore that and pick it up once I'm done unraveling. So I've picked up my second top stitch, and I'm not really sure if it's better to go into the right leg or the left leg of the stitch. By right and left leg, what I mean is when you're looking at a knit stitch, it's got 2 loops, right? This one and this one. And I don't know if it's better to go into a right or left leg, but I think as long as you're consistent, you end up with the right amount of stitches. Feel free to correct me if I'm lying about that. So you've picked up your second, and then pull twice again. And you can really just follow where that waste yarn is going so that you always know what you're doing. I will admit it's a little trickier when you're doing color work because there's floats behind the mitten, but as long as you're persistent and you have good light, it's pretty simple. And it gets easier with practice. And the other thing I like to do to make sure that I'm picking up those top stitches at the right rate is just to count, because these bottom stitches, you can see, they look just like normal stitches. Hopefully you can see. So those are really easy to count, right? Because there's 1 loop for each stitch. So right now we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bottom stitches, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're just starting the 6th top stitch, and that's fine because if you recall at the very beginning I picked up a top stitch before the bottom stitches got loose. So that's another way that I just make sure that I am on track. And just work your way across. You can see that these aren't going anywhere, even though I have not put them on a needle yet. I forgot that my camera records in 8-minute segments, and I did not realize that I'd been cut off. So I've unzipped it, and I went ahead and counted to make sure that I had 22 stitches across the top, and I did. Then I went through and just picked up all those bottom stitches, the way you would any loose stitches, and made sure that those were also 22. And now I'm ready for the next phase. Really, you've already done the most complicated part, which is unpicking that waste yarn, and you can already see that pretty soon you will be able to use your fingers whenever you need them. So I always do the cuff part, the top part first, and that's because this is the part that's visible on the outside of the mitten. So if for some reason you run out of your main yarn, I've got spare, but if you were worried about running out, if you do these parts first, you can always do this cuff in a different color. So that's why I start with the top. That, and it goes faster. So for now we're just going to ignore the bottom stitches and only focus on the top. When you're adding in the yarn for this cuff, you want to leave a longer end than you might normally, and that's because we're going to sew down these edges. We're going to mattress seam them. So it's just simpler to do if you have more of an end. And you can choose any non-curling edge you want for the mitten cuff. I'm doing 2x2 ribbing because it seemed to match the cuff, although the cuff is actually a more complicated rib, and because it worked with 22 stitches. If you need to increase or decrease 1 or 2 stitches in order for it to work with your chosen edging, that's perfectly fine. Knitting is stretchy, so it really doesn't matter. And you want to knit enough that it's not going to curl. You don't want to knit it very long because, as I said, you're going to be seaming these edges. So I would say somewhere between 1 to 2 inches, which would be 3 to 5 centimeters, is what I usually aim for. And then I just match that on the second mitten. So on the first mitten I did 6 rows before my bind off, and that's what I'm going to do now, which you guys don't need to watch me knit 2x2 ribs, so I will be speeding this up. I apologize, we've had clouds move in and the sun is setting a little earlier now that it's August, and I just forgot, so I've had to turn on a lamp. I know that that means that the lighting is kind of weird. Hopefully you can still see. that I've done my cuff and now I'm ready to bind off. And I just do a regular bind off. You can do whatever bind off you like. I personally wouldn't do one of the very stretchy ones, simply because you want it to be kind of snug. You don't want your cuff to be opening, or at least I don't in the winters here. Oops. Binding off is not my favorite part of knitting. And as long as you do an even number of rows, then you'll end up with a long end on each side to seam the cuff down. And then break that yarn, leaving a longer end. That was probably excessively long, oh well. And there you have it. Pretty sure this isn't going to be enough yarn to do the next part, so switching over to my cake. And now what we need to do, other than find the yarn end, there we go, is knit this inner bit, the inner cuff. And as you can see, this cuff is on both sides. And what you do is you knit it in, you cast on the back half of the cuff. Then you join to knit in the round. You knit in the round, bind off, and I usually do the same amount of rows that I've done for my top cuff. And then once you've bound off, you go back and you just whip stitch the cast on edge to the inside of your mitten, and you just make sure that you don't catch it through the outside. And I will show you how to do that, although I'm probably going to wait until tomorrow to show you guys the sewing part, just so that the light is as good as it can possibly be. But so I just use a regular long tail cast on. You can use any cast on you like because you're starting with new yarn anyway. And once again, you want to leave a pretty long end. Now, the palm has 22 stitches across, so I'm going to cast on a handful less. I would do 20, except I want to do 2 by 2 rib, and 20 plus 22 is 42, which does not divide evenly by 4. So I'm going to do 18 stitches. And the reason why I do that is because it just creates a slightly smaller, snugger cuff so that it's not poofing out in the mitten. And this mitten hasn't been blocked. Once it's been blocked, you won't be able to see that poofiness at all. If you're really concerned, you could always use a lighter weight yarn. But I personally like the extra warmth of having 2 layers of worsted weight. Oh, I have to cast on. So you do need double points for this, or your preferred method for small circumference knitting. So just do your cast on. I find that the long tail cast on makes stitching it at the end with whip stitch pretty easy. 4, 5, 6, 7. So what I usually do is, now I've got all those stitches cast on to one needle, I take that needle and go ahead and do my first stitch here, just to kind of anchor it, and then you work across the palm in whatever non-rolling fabric you would like. And it's going to be a little awkward because this one is just hanging out, but don't worry about it, it gets simpler. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then I add a third one. And usually, like when I was knitting the mittens and when I knit socks, I do them on 4 double points and use a 5th one to go around. So that is what I'm going to do here. And once again, I'm going to work the first stitch with the old needle just to help secure everything. So you swing your cast on needle around. So this is where I did that long tail cast on. You're just joining it up to make a circle like you would any small diameter knitting. Like all this part is just distraction. So you're like that. And as I said, I like to work the first stitch with the old needle. Just to make sure. And if you want to make sure that your cast on stitches aren't twisted, because then your cuff will have to be ripped out. And then just keep working in the round. Now I'm ready to bind off, and I just wanted to say you want to pick, once again, especially in this instance, a bind off that is not very stretchy, because you want it to fit pretty snug around your fingers so that when you have the flap open, wind is not being driven down your mitten. So go ahead and bind off, and then all the knitting is done, and all you have to do is the making up or finishing, which you do with a tapestry needle. So I'm going to wait until tomorrow to film that, but of course it will all be in the same video, so you don't have to wait. The sun has risen, it is a new day, and I am ready to show you how to finish this mitten. And so the first thing that I do is whip stitching this cast on edge to the inside of the mitten. I just use a tapestry needle. And I like to choose one that's kind of medium sharp. Not as sharp as I use for weaving in ends, but not super blunt. The super blunt ones always annoy me. So all that I do, I whip stitch it folded perpendicular as opposed to how it's going to sit, because then I can see better. And remember that you have a few fewer stitches on this cuff than you have on the back that you're stitching it to. The reason why this is all looks like stockinette stitch is because there was a lot of purling. The background is all purled, so it's the wrong side. Anyway, so just as you're whip stitching, just skip a stitch every now and then. You can figure it out in a very technical way, or you can just kind of do it as you think of it, which is my usual strategy. So I did a long tail cast on, and as I said, I find this one really easy for whip stitching. So all I do is go under one of those cast on edges, and then you can kind of see that this is the row that is like the horizontal equivalent, basically. So that's the row, and I just go under one stitch, and then I move on to the next one. I guess we won't skip yet. And then when I'm doing it into a purl stitch, which is what you'll usually be doing, let's see if I can get that to focus, then make sure that you go into the purl bump so that you know that it's not going to be seen. And you can always check and flip it over. Whoops, sorry. You can always flip it over to make sure that you're not showing, but I've never had a problem just whip stitching it in. So I'll show you what I do when it's a knit stitch. So here's the knit stitch V. I go under one of the legs. As I was saying, I've never had a problem with it showing through. And you just kind of do that across. Let's see. Go into that purl stitch. So I think you have the basic idea, and I am going to finish whip stitching this and be back to show you how you finish off the top part of the cuff. I have stitched this down, so now I'm ready for the final part, which is just stitching these sides together. And you can use any sewing method that you like. I happen to enjoy mattress seaming, so that's what I'm going to show you. And in case you have not mattress seamed before, I thought I would do a brief explanation of the concept. So between stitches, if you kind of gently tug them out, you can see there's these horizontal lines, right? Ooh, there we go. Between all the knit stitches. I'm really sorry about my inability to look at something myself. So where my finger is pointing, do you see those horizontal stitches? Those are between all stitches. And I demonstrated for ease between the stockinette stitches, but they're there with the purl stitches too. They're just visible. So when you mattress seam, what you're doing is you're going under one of those horizontal bars between the two stitches. And then you're going under the same bar on the other piece of fabric that you want to join together. And that's how you get that really invisible seam look, is because you're going where you're just following the knitted fabric. So that's the principle of mattress seaming. And I showed you in the middle of it because when you get to edges, edge stitches like to kind of curve around, so it's trickier to show you. And once again, whoops, you are just going to seam this down to the body of the mitten, not to the cuff that you've just knit, because remember, you want it to be fairly square. So what I do is, I know that I'm going to mattress seam one stitch in from the edge on the cuff, right? And then I just kind of find a likely column on the mitten, and I just follow that column all the way down. As long as I'm following the same column, the seam is going to end up straight. So in this case, I'm going to follow this column. And so I tend to go 2 horizontal bars at a time because it goes quicker. So, whoops. I went under 2 bars on the mitten body, and then I'm going to go under 2 bars on the mitten cuff. And because that stitch is pretty loose, I'm going to pull my yarn first, because remember that stitch is attached to this end yarn, so that snugs up that first stitch that was super loose and awkward looking before. So now I can go right in, and then I just work my way down. I'm happy to do a full video on mattress seaming if you would like. I'm sure that there are lots of excellent tutorials with better focus already on YouTube, but for this I just wanted to explain the principle so that when you saw me doing it, you understood what was going on. Okay, so that goes nice and quickly because it's only 6 rows. And hopefully the camera will focus. Okay, so here's the seam. And that's what I love about mattress stitching, is that that seam just is quite invisible. But honestly, any sewing method that works. So you do that on both sides, and then all you have to do is weave in your ends, and you are finished converting your mittens. And now I have another converted mitten. So you end up with 4 extra ends to weave in, which is a little bit of a hassle, but not as much of a hassle as trying to pull your mittens on and off every time that you need your fingers all winter. Hope that was helpful. I think that I set my camera up at a worse angle than my last tutorial video. It's tricky because if I have the camera pointing straight down, then the tripod legs are in the shot. So that's why I have it at a bit of an angle, but I definitely need to practice. It's been quite a while since I've recorded one of these. But I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Bye!